Lieutenant Jake Morrison had been working on the exploration ship Horizon's Edge for 3 years, and he thought he had seen everything the universe could show him, but he was wrong about that, because today would change everything he believed about space and aliens and what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of mysteries. The distress signal came through during the night shift when most of the crew was sleeping, and Jake was one of the few people awake to hear it, and the signal was weak and broken, but it was definitely there, calling out from somewhere in the asteroid field that their ship was passing through, and Captain Linda Hayes ordered an immediate investigation, because that was what humans did when someone needed help. Jake suited up with the rescue team, and they took a small shuttle out into the darkness where rocks the size of buildings floated silently through space. And the wreckage they found was unlike anything in their databases because it was clearly alien technology with strange curves and metals that seemed to shift colors in their lights, and inside the broken pod was something that made Jake's heart skip a beat. She was small and fragile looking, with skin that was pale blue like ice on a winter morning, and her eyes were huge and violet-colored and filled with fear when she saw them approaching. And she wore what might have been a uniform once, but now it was torn and stained, and Jake could see that she was thin, too thin, like she had not eaten in a very long time. Captain Hayes told them to bring the alien aboard carefully, and they did, being as gentle as they could, because she looked like she might break if they handled her roughly. And once they got her into the medical bay, Dr. Henry Phillips started running tests to figure out how to help her. But her biology was so different from humans that it was hard to know what would work and what might hurt her. The alien girl did not speak at first, or maybe she could not speak, because their universal translator was having trouble with her language, and all it produced was static and broken sounds that made no sense. But her eyes told Jake everything he needed to know, because they were the eyes of someone who had been through something terrible and was afraid it was not over yet. Jake volunteered to stay with her during his off hours because something about her reminded him of his little sister back on Earth, and he could not stand the thought of her being alone and afraid in this strange place surrounded by giants who spoke a language she did not understand. And Dr. Phillips said it was fine, as long as Jake did not interfere with the medical work on. The third day, Jake made a decision that would change the course of history for 2 entire civilizations, though he did not know it at the time because he was just thinking about a scared alien girl who looked hungry, and he reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the chocolate ration bars his mother sent him in care packages from Earth. The alien girl stared at the bar like she did not know what it was, and then she looked at Jake's face with those huge violet eyes, and the translator finally kicked in with one word that came through clearly. And that word was safe, and it was a question, not a statement. Jake smiled at her and broke off a piece of the chocolate bar and ate it himself to show her it was not dangerous. And then he held out the rest toward her and said the word safe back to her, but this time it was an answer, not a question. She took the bar with hands that shook and brought it slowly to her mouth and took a tiny bite, and Jake watched as her expression changed from fear to surprise to something that looked like hope. And she ate the rest of the chocolate slowly, like it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. And when she finished, she looked at Jake with tears in her violet eyes. "My name is Jake," he said, pointing to himself and waiting to see if she would understand Kira. She whispered back, and it was the first clear word the translator had managed to pick up from her language, and her voice was soft and beautiful like music. Over the next few days, Kira got stronger, and Dr. Phillips was amazed at how fast she recovered, and he thought maybe it was the combination of the medicine they were giving her and the human food that Jake kept bringing, because Kira seemed to really like Earth food, especially anything sweet like fruits and candy. As Kira got better, she started talking more, and the translator got better at understanding her language, and she told them that her people were called the Vane, and that they came from a world called Ventara that was very far away from Earth, and she seemed interested in everything about humans and asked a million questions about their home planet. Jake showed her pictures of Earth on his data pad, and Kira looked at images of oceans and forests and mountains like she was seeing magic for the first time, and she asked about rain and snow and what it was like to have a pet. And Jake answered every question as best he could, while Captain Hayes and the other officers tried to find out more important things like why Kira had been alone in an escape pod in the middle of nowhere. But whenever someone asked Kira about how she got into that pod or why she was alone, she would stop talking, and her eyes would fill with sadness, and she would turn away and refuse to say anything more about it. and Jake told the captain to give her time because clearly something bad had happened and pushing her would not help. Captain Hayes agreed, because she was a good captain, who understood that sometimes people needed time to heal before they could talk about their trauma. And so they let Kira recover and learn about humans and get comfortable on the ship. One evening, Jake was sitting with Kira in the medical bay, and he was telling her a story about the time he and his sister went camping in the mountains on Earth, and Kira was listening with her eyes wide. And then she said something that made Jake stop talking. "Your world sounds like paradise," she said, and her voice was full of longing. Jake laughed a little and said that Earth had problems too because humans were not perfect and they made mistakes and sometimes they fought with each other, but they were trying to do better, and they were learning. Kira looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, and she said something that seemed strange at the time but would make sense later. And she said, "You give me food and you ask for nothing in return, and you show me kindness when I am nothing to you. And this is unusual." Jake shrugged because to him, it was not unusual at all, and he said that humans believed in helping people who needed help and that it was just the right thing to do. Something changed in Kira's face then, like she had made a decision about something important. And she looked at Jake with determination in her violet eyes and said, "I need to speak with your captain because there is something I must tell you all about my people, and about why I was in that pod." Jake felt a chill run down his spine because of the serious way Kira was talking, and he asked if she was sure because she did not have to tell them anything she was not ready to share. "I must," she said firmly, "because of the food you gave me, and because of your kindness, and I cannot let you remain ignorant of what is coming." And then she paused and looked directly into Jake's eyes and said, "Your ship is in great danger and all of humanity is in danger, and I am the only one who can warn you about what my people are planning to do to your world." Captain Linda Hayes called a meeting within an hour of Kira's request, and all the important officers gathered in the conference room, including Commander Peter Grant, who was the first officer, and Lieutenant Sophie Martinez, who handled weapons and tactics, and Dr. Phillips came too along with Chief Engineer Carl Anderson, and Jake stood beside Kira to support her, because he could see she was nervous. Kira stood at the head of the table looking tiny compared to all the humans around her, but she held her head high and her violet eyes were filled with determination, and Captain Hayes nodded at her to begin speaking. "I must start by telling you something difficult," Kira said, and her voice was steady, even though Jake could see her, hands shaking a little. And she said that everything humans think about space travel is based on a wrong idea, because humans believe that species who can travel between stars must have evolved beyond being cruel and violent. But that is not true. Commander Grant interrupted and said that humans knew conflict existed even among advanced species. But Kira shook her head and said, "No. You do not understand because my people, the Vain, are not refugees or explorers or traders." And she paused before saying, "We are hunters and we have been hunting for 3,000 years. The room went completely silent and everyone stared at Kira, and Captain Hayes leaned forward and told her to explain what she meant by hunters. Kira took a deep breath and began telling them a story that made Jake's blood run cold, and she said that long ago her world was dying because they had used up all their resources, and instead of finding ways to live sustainably, the Vain leaders decided to develop technology that would let them travel to other worlds and take what they needed from other species. The Vain Collective survives by finding civilizations that have not yet developed space travel or have just started exploring space," Kira explained, and her voice was filled with shame, "and we take everything from them, including their resources and their technology and their knowledge and their people, and we use these beings as workers and servants and slaves, and then we move on to the next world." Dr. Phillips looked horrified and asked how many civilizations the Vain had done this to, and Kira whispered 47 and said that in 3,000 years her people had destroyed 47 intelligent species, and some of them had fought back, but none of them had succeeded in stopping the Vain and Earth. Captain Hayes asked, but her voice sounded like Ice Earth has been designated as target number 48, Kira said, and tears started rolling down her blue cheeks, and she explained that Vain scouts had found Earth 12 years ago, and since then the collective had been preparing a harvest fleet to come and take everything, and she said the fleet was already on its way and would arrive in approximately 8 months. The room erupted with everyone talking at once, and Commander Grant stood up so fast his chair fell over, and he said this was absurd, and asked how they could not have detected a fleet coming toward them, and he said their sensors would have picked up something. Your technology is primitive compared to ours, Kira said bluntly, and then quickly added that she meant no offense, but humanity had only just begun exploring beyond their own solar system, while the Vane had been perfecting stealth technology and weapons for thousands of years, and she said humans would not detect the fleet until it was too late to stop it. Sophie Martinez demanded to know why they should believe Kira, because she could be lying or trying to trick them somehow, and Jake started to object, but Kira held up her hand to stop him. I understand your suspicion, Kira said calmly, and I would feel the same way in your position, but I can prove what I am saying is true. And she pulled out a small device that the crew had let her keep from her escape pod, and she said this contains complete information about Vane ships and weapons and tactics, and it also contains all the survey data about Earth, including where your resources are and where your people live and what defenses you have. Captain Hayes took the device carefully and told Chief Anderson to take it to his lab and analyze everything on it immediately, and Anderson nodded and left quickly with the device. Kira continued talking and said there was more they needed to understand, and she needed to explain why she was telling them all of this and why she had been alone in that escape pod, and her voice became softer and more personal. I am the daughter of High Commander Vech, Kira said, and several officers gasped, because clearly that was an important title, and she explained that her father was the leader of the Harvest Fleet coming to Earth, and that she had been raised to become a commander herself and continue the Vane legacy of conquest. But I began to question everything, Kira said, and she explained that the more she learned about the species the Vane had destroyed, the more she doubted whether what they were doing was right. And 2 months ago she had accessed restricted files about Earth and seen images and videos of human life. I saw your music and your art, Kira said, and her voice was full of emotion, and I watched humans helping each other after disasters, and I saw your capacity for kindness alongside your capacity for violence, and I realized that you deserved a chance to survive, and that all those other species we destroyed deserved chances too, but they never got them. So you ran, Dr. Phillips said gently. I did more than run, Kira replied, and she said that before she escaped, she had sabotaged 3 of the main warships in the fleet, and it was not enough to stop them completely, but it was enough to slow them down and give her time to find humans first and warn them. My father will hunt me forever for what I have done, Kira said, and tears were streaming down her face now, and she said that by Vane law, her punishment for treason would be death, and they would erase every trace of her existence from their records as if she had never been born. Captain Hayes studied Kira for a long moment, and then asked why she was telling them this just because Jake had given her some food, and she said it seemed like a small kindness to inspire such a huge betrayal of her own people. Kira smiled sadly and said that it was not a small kindness to her because for 2 months she had been drifting in that escape pod, rationing failing supplies and waiting to die rather than be captured, and she had been prepared for death. But instead, she found humans, and the first thing one of them did was share his food with her without asking for anything in return. In Vane culture, food is power, Kira explained, and it is never shared freely, only traded or used to control others. But you gave me food because I was hungry, and you sat with me because I was alone, and you showed me kindness because it was the right thing to do. And that is not a small thing, and that is everything. She turned to look directly at Jake and said that is what the Vane have lost, and what humanity must not lose no matter what happens in the coming war. Commander Grant spoke up, and his skepticism was tempered now with respect, and he asked what Kira expected them to do, because one ship could not fight an entire fleet. I do not expect you to fight them alone, Kira said, firmly, and she said she expected them to prepare and to warn their leaders and to give humanity 8 months to get ready, and she told them that Chief Anderson would verify the technical data she had given them, but there was something else to consider. If I am lying, Kira said, and if this is some elaborate trick, then what do I gain from it? And she pointed out that she was alone and injured and at their mercy, and she had given them everything, including information that made her own people their enemy. She has a point, Dr. Phillips admitted, Captain Hayes stood up and started giving orders, and she told Commander Grant to plot a course for the nearest human colony because they needed to get this information to Earth Command as fast as possible. And she told Sophie to start analyzing the tactical data, and she turned to Kira and said that Kira would remain in protective custody, not as a prisoner, but for her own safety. "I understand," Kira said quietly. As the meeting ended, Jake stayed beside Kira and told her that what she did took real courage. "Courage is easy when you have already lost everything," Kira replied, "but hope is harder." And she looked at Jake with those violet eyes and said that she had hope because of him, and hope that humanity would survive, and hope that humans would not become like the Vane in their desperation to defend themselves. Jake wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, but he knew the truth was more complicated because humans were capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty, and the coming months would test which side would win. "We will do our best," Jake said, simply because that was all anyone could promise. "Your best may be enough," Kira said, "because the Vane have never faced a species that fights not just for survival, but for the right to remain kind." The Horizon's Edge pushed its engines to maximum speed as it raced toward New Olympus Station, which was the largest human settlement in the outer colonies, and Chief Engineer Carl Anderson had spent 3 days straight analyzing the data from Kira's device, and he barely slept because what he found was terrifying and important. Captain Hayes called Anderson to her office and asked him what he had discovered, and Anderson looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp with fear and excitement, and he told her that everything Kira said was true, and all the technical specifications and tactical documents and survey data about Earth checked out perfectly. "It gets worse," Anderson said, and he explained that Vane technology was decades ahead of human technology in some areas and maybe centuries ahead in others, and their weapons were more powerful and their shields were stronger, and their ships could travel faster than anything humans had built. Captain Hayes asked him directly what their chances were in a straight fight, and Anderson hesitated before answering, and he said that in a direct battle, humanity had almost no chance of winning. But then he said that Kira had not just given them information, but had given them the Vane playbook, and every tactic they had used in 47 previous conquests was documented. "If we are smart," Hayes said, "and if we use what Kira taught us, then maybe we have a shot." And Anderson nodded and said, "Maybe, but it would take everything humanity had." Over the next 2 weeks, the ship sent encrypted messages to Earth Command every 6 hours, updating them on the situation. And when the response finally came, it was fast and decisive, and Earth's entire military began mobilizing, and colonies throughout human space were warned, and defensive platforms started being built at key strategic points. Jake spent most of his time with Kira, helping her work with teams of tactical analysts, and Commander Peter Grant had set aside his skepticism and now worked closely with her, translating her knowledge of Vane strategy into plans that humans could actually use. Kira explained to them that the Vane always began with isolated targets like small settlements and remote outposts, and she said they tested response times and coordination and technology with these probing attacks, and each probe taught them more about their enemy, and by the time the main fleet arrived, they knew exactly how their target would respond to every threat. "So we need to be unpredictable," Lieutenant Sophie Martinez said while studying the holographic displays that showed previous Vane attacks. "More than that," Kira replied, and she said humans needed to show the Vane capabilities that they did not actually have, and she explained that misdirection was their greatest weapon, because the Vane were arrogant after 3,000 years of never losing, and humans could use that arrogance against them. When the Horizon's Edge finally docked at New Olympus Station, Jake saw that the place had been transformed, and Admiral Gregory Stone, who commanded Earth's colonial defense forces, had taken personal charge of the situation, and he was a stern man in his 60s with gray hair and hard eyes that had seen too much combat. Admiral Stone met with Kira, and his expression softened slightly when he saw how young and small she was, and he told her formally that on behalf of humanity, he wanted to thank her for the warning she had given them, because she had given them a fighting chance. "I only hope it is enough," Kira said quietly. Over the following months, Jake watched as humans came together in a way he had never seen before, and old political rivalries were set aside and resources were pooled, and scientists who had competed for funding now collaborated freely, and military forces from different nations trained together. Dr. Phillips worked with Kira to understand vein biology, looking for weaknesses, and what he found was sobering. Because the vein were hardy and resistant to most toxins and could survive in many different environments, but they had one significant vulnerability. They are adapted to low radiation environments, Phillips explained, and he said their homeworld had a weak magnetic field and was far from their sun, so high-intensity radiation exposure degraded their cellular structure rapidly. So we hit them with radiation weapons, Sophie said, if we had any. Anderson replied grimly, and he explained that radiation weapons had been banned after the Unity Wars, and humans did not have the infrastructure to produce them in the time they had left. Then we improvise, Admiral Stone declared, and he said that if high radiation hurt the vein, then humans would use what they had, including solar flares and reactor cores and anything that produced hard radiation. And he told Anderson to work with every engineer in the fleet to find ways to weaponize their power sources. Within weeks, human engineers developed techniques to overload fusion reactors in controlled bursts, creating radiation pulses that could be directed at enemy ships. And mining vessels were retrofitted with enhanced drilling lasers that could pierce vein armor, and civilian transports were converted into drone carriers. But the most significant development came from Dr. Henry Nakamura, who was a physicist from Earth, and he proposed using the sun itself as a weapon, and he explained that the vein survey data showed they planned to avoid the solar corona because they were afraid of it. What if we could lure them in close? Nakamura asked, and he suggested using gravity wells to trap vein ships near the sun, where the radiation would kill them. It was risky and required precise coordination, and ships willing to act as bait. But it was exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that might work against an enemy used to easy victories. Through all of this, Kira worked tirelessly alongside the humans, and she trained pilots on vein attack patterns and helped engineers understand alien power systems and advised diplomats on vein psychology. And slowly something changed in her. Jake noticed it one evening as they shared a meal in the station's observation deck, watching the stars, and he told her she seemed different somehow and lighter. "I have purpose now," Kira said, and she explained that her entire life she had been told her purpose was to conquer and continue the vein legacy. But here, working with humans, she had found a different purpose, and that was to protect and help and build instead of destroy. She looked at Jake and said that he had given her more than food that day in the medical bay, and he had given her a choice about who she wanted to be. "You gave yourself that choice," Jake said, and he reminded her that she decided to warn humanity, and he had just offered her a candy bar. "Never underestimate the power of a kind gesture," Kira said softly, and she explained that the vein had forgotten this truth, and they saw kindness as weakness. But she had learned that it took far more strength to be kind than to be cruel. As months passed, Earth's defenders grew more confident, and simulations showed that while the vein fleet was still superior in raw power, human ingenuity had closed the gap, and the plan was audacious and involved letting the vein believe humanity was weaker than they were, and then luring them into traps and hitting them with unexpected tactics. But there was one problem nobody wanted to discuss, and that was the fact that Kira's father, High Commander Vec, would be leading the fleet, and he would know his daughter had betrayed him. And according to vein tradition, the punishment for such treason was not just death, but complete erasure from all records, as if the traitor had never existed. "I do not fear death," Kira told Jake when he finally brought up the subject, "but I fear I will not live to see humanity prevail, and that would be my only regret." "Then let's make sure you survive," Jake said firmly, and he told her that someone needed to be there after the war to help humans and vein figure out how to coexist. Because if humans won, then the vein would need a new path, and Kira was the only one who could show them that path existed. Kira looked surprised and asked if Jake would spare the vein after everything they had done. "If we destroy them completely, we become no better than they are," Jake said, and he told her there had to be a way forward that did not end in genocide for either. Side Admiral Stone echoed this sentiment in his final briefing before the fleet deployed, and he told the assembled commanders that their goal was not extermination, but survival, and if possible, peace. And he said they fought to protect themselves, not to become conquerors. And he reminded them that they were not the Vane and that being human meant something important. 3 days later, the long-range sensors picked up the first signs of the Vane fleet, and they were right on schedule exactly where Kira had predicted and the invasion had begun. The Vane Harvest fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system, and it was a formation of 60 warships that represented 3,000 years of accumulated military power, and High Commander Vec stood on the bridge of his flagship called the Dominant, surveying the tactical displays with satisfaction, because this was just another primitive species to conquer and another world to strip bare. But as his scanners swept the system, Vec felt his first stirring of unease because the humans were not fleeing like other species had done, and instead they were deploying in unusual formations, scattered throughout the system in clusters that made no tactical sense, and it was as if they were waiting for something. Vec ordered his communications officer to send the standard surrender terms, and the message was transmitted in the human language that Vane linguists had decoded from Earth broadcasts. And it said that humanity was facing the Vane Collective and should submit to integration, and their deaths would be painless if they cooperated, but if they resisted, then they would watch their world burn. The response came within minutes, but it was not from a military channel, and instead, it was a general broadcast that every ship in the Ven fleet could hear, and the voice was one that Vec recognized instantly, and it froze his blood. Father Kira's voice said, and it was clear and steady, and she told him she was speaking not as his daughter, but as someone who had found a better way, and she said the humans would not surrender and they would fight and they would win, not because they were stronger, but because they were willing to sacrifice for each other in ways the Vane had forgotten. She told her father to turn back and said there was still time to end this without bloodshed. Vec's hands clenched on his command throne, and he hissed the word traitor, and he demanded to know how Kira could side with these primitives against her own blood. Side with those who showed me kindness when I was at my weakest, Kira replied, and she said that was something the Vane would never do, and she told her father she did not wish to see him die, but she would not let him destroy these people. You will die for this betrayal, Vec swore, and he said he would erase every trace of her existence from Vane history, and she would be less than nothing. I am already more than nothing, Kira said softly, and she told him she was someone who chose compassion over conquest and asked if he could say the same. Vec cut the transmission and turned to his tactical officer and ordered him to begin the assault, and he said he wanted the sector where Kira's transmission originated obliterated, and he wanted his daughter killed first. The Vane fleet surged forward with weapons charging, but as they closed on the human positions, the first surprise hit them because the scattered human ships suddenly lit up with energy signatures far higher than the survey data had indicated, and they had been hiding their true power output, making themselves appear weaker than they actually were. Admiral Stone watched from the bridge of the newly built warship called the Victory as the Vane fleet took the bait, and he ordered all ships to execute the Alpha attack pattern and told them to show the Vane what humanity could do. The battle erupted across 1 billion kilometers of space, and human ships darted in and out of engagement range using superior maneuverability to offset the Vane's stronger shields and mining lasers that had been repurposed for combat, punched through Ven armor with unexpected efficiency, and reactor bombs that were crude but effective, detonated among Ven formations, flooding them with deadly radiation. But the Vane were not the masters of conquest for nothing, and they adapted quickly, rotating damaged ships out of the fight and bringing fresh vessels forward, and their weapons, which were more precise and powerful, began taking a toll, and 3 human cruisers exploded in the first hour, and then 5 more. Jake piloted a fighter from the Victory's launch bay, leading a squadron in hit-and-run attacks against Vane escort ships, and beside him, Sophie Martinez commanded the tactical coordination, while Carl Anderson kept the carrier systems running despite damage from near misses. They are learning our patterns, Sophie warned, and she said they needed to switch tactics immediately. Admiral Stone ordered them to execute Plan Beta and told them to lead the Vane toward the sun. The Victory and a dozen other capital ships began a fighting retreat toward the inner system, drawing a significant portion of the Vane fleet after them, and High Commander Vec saw the maneuver and smiled coldly because he thought the humans were running and falling back toward their homeworld, and he was satisfied because it would make the final conquest more satisfying. But as the chase continued, Vec noticed something odd because the human ships were not heading for Earth and instead they were angling toward the sun, getting dangerously close to the solar corona, and he suddenly realized it was a trap and ordered his ships to pull back. He was right, but it was too late because the human ships executed a synchronized jump to faster than light speed, and it was a micro-jump that lasted less than a second, but carried them clear of the danger zone, and the Vane ships, unable to react in time, found themselves caught in massive gravity wells created by precisely positioned human platforms. Dr. Nakamura's plan had worked perfectly, and the Vane fleet was dragged toward the sun unable to break free, and radiation from the star washed over them, and screams echoed through Vane communication channels as crews began to sicken and die from the exposure emergency jump. Now Vake roared, and several ships managed to tear free with their jump drives straining at maximum. But 15 Ven warships unable to escape were pulled into the solar corona and vaporized instantly. The Vane fleet regrouped, and now they had 45 ships instead of 60. And for the first time in 3,000 years, they had suffered significant losses in a single engagement, and Vex stared at the tactical display with his confidence badly shaken. "The humans have been taught our weaknesses," his second-in-command observed, and he said that Kira had betrayed them completely. "Then we show them that knowledge alone is not enough." Vex snarled, and he ordered all ships to converge on Earth itself, and said they would bombard the planet from orbit and let the traitor watch her new friends burn. The Vane fleet charged toward Earth, but this time they met the full weight of humanity's defense, and every ship and every station and every armed platform opened fire simultaneously, and the space around Earth became a storm of energy and metal and explosions. Jake's fighter took a glancing hit, and his shields failed and he spun out of control, watching as the battle raged around him and through his cockpit window. He could see Earth below, beautiful and blue and home to 8 billion people who were counting on them to protect them. "Not today," he muttered as he fought to right his craft, and he said not ever. He dove back into the fight, joining a desperate push to protect a damaged human cruiser, and around him thousands of other pilots were doing the same thing, sacrificing themselves to protect others, and it was this spirit more than any weapon that began to turn the tide of battle. The Vane had never faced an enemy that fought like this, because in every previous conquest, once losses mounted, the defenders would scatter, trying to save themselves, but the humans did the opposite, and the more dire the situation became, the more fiercely they fought together, aboard the Victory. Kira watched the battle with tears streaming down her face, and she saw her people dying by the hundreds. But she also saw them killing humans and destroying ships crewed by people who had shown her nothing but kindness. "This is my fault," she whispered. "No," Captain Hayes said firmly, standing beside her, and she told Kira this was her father's fault, and that Kira had given humanity a chance, and what they did with it was on them, not on her. The battle raged for 6 hours, and it was brutal and costly, and when it finally ended, 20 Vane ships remained, and they were retreating at maximum speed, and humanity had lost 40% of its fleet, but Earth still stood, and the invasion had been repelled. High Commander Vex stared at the casualty reports in disbelief, because this was impossible, and the Vane did not lose and could not lose, and yet they had, and he opened a channel to his remaining ships and said they would retreat, but this was not over, and they would return with reinforcements. No, Father Kira's voice cut through the channel, and she told him it was over and asked him to look at what his arrogance had cost and to look at the lives lost on both sides, and she asked if this was truly what he wanted for the Vane and said it would be an eternity of conquest until they finally met a species strong enough to destroy them completely. "Better conquest than weakness." Vake spat back at her. "I have learned," Kira said quietly, "that there is no weakness in kindness and only strength," and she told him the humans could have destroyed his remaining ships, but they were letting him go, not because they were weak, but because they hoped he would choose a better path, and she begged him to choose that path before it was too late. Beck said nothing for a long moment, and then he cut the channel, and his fleet jumped to faster than light speed and vanished from the solar system. 3 months after the battle for Earth ended, and as humans began rebuilding their shattered fleets and mourning their dead, an unexpected transmission reached the solar system, and it came from deep space from a Vane vessel traveling alone. Admiral Stone, who was still commanding from the Victory, received the message with cautious interest, and he told his staff that it was from High Commander Vec, and that he wanted to negotiate. It is a trap, Commander Grant said immediately. But Kira, who had remained with the human fleet as an advisor, shook her head and said that her father did not believe in deception, and if he said he wanted to negotiate, then he meant it, though she admitted she did not understand why. The meeting was arranged on neutral ground at an abandoned trading post halfway between human and Vane space, and Admiral Stone brought a small delegation including himself and Captain Hayes and Commander Grant and Sophie Martinez, and Jake and Kira was not officially invited, but she insisted on coming and said she must face her father one way or another. High Commander Vake arrived with only 2 guards, which was either a show of confidence or weakness, and he looked older than Kira remembered, with his blue skin looking dull and his posture less rigid, and when his eyes fell on his daughter something flickered in them that might have been pain or anger, or perhaps regret. Traitor, he said, but the word did not carry the venom it had before. Father Kira replied calmly. Vec turned to Admiral Stone and said he had come to discuss terms of peace. The humans exchanged surprised glances, and Stone said carefully that Vec should go on and explain. After our defeat, I returned to Ventara. Vec began, and he said he had expected to be received as a commander who had suffered an unfortunate setback, but instead he found chaos, and word of their loss had spread throughout the collective, and for 3,000 years, the Vane had been invincible, and the revelation that they could be beaten had shaken the very foundations of their society. He showed them holographic displays and said that several of their subject species had begun rebellions because they saw weakness now, where before they saw only strength. And he said, the collective was fracturing, and within a generation they might face complete collapse. And you want our help? Hayes asked with clear disbelief in her voice. No, Vec said firmly, and he explained that he wanted to learn from humans and understand how a species that should have been easy prey had defeated them so thoroughly. And he said it was not their tactics or weapons that puzzled him, because those he understood, but it was their spirit and their willingness to sacrifice for each other. He looked directly at Kira and said his daughter had tried to explain that it came from kindness and compassion, but he had not believed her. And he said he had spent 3 months reviewing battle records and watched human pilots sacrifice themselves to save others, and saw engineers give their lives to protect civilians, and observed behavior that by Venn standards was completely irrational, and yet it had made them stronger, not weaker. Jake spoke up and said with respect that it was not complicated, because humans cared about each other and believed every life had value, and that was not a military tactic but just who they were, but why Vake demanded, and he asked what advantage it provided, and how caring for the weak made them strong, because the weak become strong when they are cared for. Kira said softly, and she told her father that she had been weak when the humans found her, and by his standards, she should have been left to die, but instead they saved her, and fed her, and showed her kindness, and in return she gave them everything she had not because she was forced to, but because she wanted to. And she said that was the power of compassion, because it turned potential enemies into allies. Vake was silent for a long time, and finally, he spoke and said the Vane Collective was dying, and their way of life was unsustainable, and they had known this for generations but were too proud to admit it, and he said humanity's victory had forced them to confront the truth. He straightened and met Admiral Stone's gaze and proposed an exchange and said the Vane would cease all hostile actions against humanity and their allies, and in return, humans would help them find a new path and teach them how to build instead of destroy, and show them this compassion that made them strong. And the 47 species you have enslaved, Stone asked pointedly, and demanded to know what would become of them. They will be freed, Vec said. And each word seemed to cost him greatly, and he said, it would take time and there would be resistance within the collective, but he would make it happen. And this he swore. Why should we trust you? Grant demanded. Vec reached up and removed the command insignia from his uniform, which was a symbol of authority worn by Vane leaders for thousands of years, and he placed it on the table between them, and said he was willing to surrender his power to make this happen, and if the price of peace was his own humiliation, then so be it. And he said he was tired of being a monster, and his daughter had shown him there was another way, and he wanted to learn that way even if he was too old to truly change. Kira stared at her father with tears welling in her violet eyes and whispered his name. You were right, Kira, Vec said, and his voice was rough with emotion, and he admitted he was wrong, and said it was the hardest thing he had ever had to admit. But watching their civilization crumble, and seeing the fear and hatred in the eyes of species they had subjugated, he finally understood, and he said the Vane had become what they despised most, which was the strong preying on the weak. And it must end. Admiral Stone looked at his staff and asked for their opinions. It could be a trick, Grant said, though his tone was less certain than before. Even if it is, we gain intelligence by engaging. Sophie offered. I think he is sincere, Hayes said. As strange as that sounds. Jake looked at Kira, who nodded slightly, and he said, they should take the chance, because that was what they had been saying all along, that there had to be a path forward that did not end in genocide. And here it was, and someone had to take the first step. Stone considered for a moment, then extended his hand to Vake and said, they accepted his offer, but he must understand that humans would be watching, and any sign of betrayal or any indication this was a trick, and they would respond with everything they had. And he reminded Vek that the Vane had seen what humanity could do. When backed into a corner, Vek took the offered hand, and the gesture was awkward and clearly unfamiliar to him, and he said he understood and accepted their terms. Over the following year, the relationship between humanity and the Vane slowly transformed, and it was not easy because there were hardliners on both sides who opposed any cooperation, and several assassination attempts were made against Vek by Vane, who saw his peace initiative as treason, and human colonies attacked Vane supply ships in revenge for the invasion attempt. But gradually progress was made, and human engineers helped Vane scientists develop sustainable technologies, and Vane medical knowledge, which was far in advance of humanity's, was shared freely, curing diseases that had plagued humans for generations, and the freed slave species who were wary at first began to engage in cautious diplomacy with both parties. Kira became a bridge between the two civilizations, and she worked tirelessly traveling between human and Vane space, teaching both sides about each other, and it was exhausting work and often thankless, but she never wavered. Jake, who was promoted to commander after the battle, often accompanied her on these missions, and their friendship had deepened into something more, though they rarely spoke of it directly because it seemed almost trivial compared to the massive work of reshaping galactic civilization. But one evening, aboard a transport heading to a peace conference on Ventara, Jake found Kira alone in the observation deck, which was the same place they had shared so many conversations before. Do you ever regret it? He asked, joining her at the window. And he said all of this started because he gave her a candy bar, and her whole life changed. Kira smiled and said her whole life changed because she chose to let it change, and the candy bar was just a catalyst. And she turned to face him and said she wanted to tell him something. In Vane culture, we have a concept called Fekhara, she explained, and she said it meant a debt that could never be repaid, and a life bond that transcended time and circumstance. And she told Jake she felt Fekhara toward him. I did not save your life expecting anything in return, Jake said. Softly, I know, Kira replied, and she said, that was why the debt was so profound, because he gave freely expecting nothing, and in doing so he gave her more than life, and he gave her purpose and hope and a future worth living. And she reached out and took his hand and said she wanted to spend that future with him if he would have her, and not because she owed him, but because she chose him, and because she loved him. Jake felt his heart race, and he thought about how a year ago, a human and a Vane together would have been impossible, but so much had changed, and he said he loved her too, and that he had for a while now. They stood together watching the stars, and they were two people from different worlds who had found common ground in kindness and compassion. 3 years later, the Vane Collective officially dissolved itself and reformed as the Vane Commonwealth, which was a voluntary association of species working together for mutual benefit, and the 47 enslaved species gained independence, though many chose to remain in association with the Commonwealth. Recognizing that cooperation benefited everyone, Vec, now simply called by his name without titles, served as an advisor to the new Com.